Civil Emergency and Defense Agency. You may know them better as CEDA. Throughout the story of Left 4 Dead, this government organization is in an uphill fight against the green flu virus, attempting to study it, contain it, and above all else, keep the public safe. The story of Left 4 Dead is mainly told through environmental storytelling and in-game dialogue, and if you dig through the campaigns and other sources like the comic, you can piece together what went wrong during the early stages of the green flu outbreak. If you're at all familiar with the story of Left 4 Dead, you'll know that the green flu virus would prove too much for CEDA to handle, and today I wanted to piece together a timeline of CEDA's failures and highlight where they went wrong in their fight against the virus. Not only do I get the chance to finally talk about CEDA, I also get the chance to delve deeper into the lore of Left 4 Dead and go over some things that I missed in prior videos. Without wasting any more time, let's get started. Let's start in Savannah, Georgia, the location of the Dead Center campaign. This campaign has a lot of interesting lore like the CEDA graph in Chapter 1, but for this segment of the video, I want to mainly focus on some voice lines from everyone's favorite producer. Rochelle may not be a fan favorite character, but her backstory is relevant to the topic of this video. Rochelle works for a news station. Not only that, she's specifically covering a big story involving CEDA evacuation centers in Savannah. Checking the photo on Rochelle's wiki page, you can see CEDA agents in the background, meaning she's working on site with other CEDA agents covering this story. Overall point is, of all the characters to have information on CEDA and the green flu outbreak, a producer for a big-name news station would have plenty of credible sources. Not to mention the hands-on experience of working directly with CEDA agents. And throughout the Dead Center campaign, Rochelle does have a few voice lines mentioning CEDA. Let's break down a few of them individually.
Reports were really fragmented. CEDA never told anyone it was this bad.
Rochelle mentions that reports were fragmented, implying that CEDA is giving these reports in a panicked haste, just providing whatever answers they can to get the media off their backs. This next voice line from Rochelle is the one that I really want to talk about.
We should take some weapons. I work in the news, and the news says we should definitely take some weapons.
The news is telling the public to arm themselves, but throughout the Dead Center campaign, you can find various CEDA papers telling survivors that firearm possession is not permitted. It should also be noted that the Vanna Hotel is one of these CEDA evacuation centers, and throughout Chapter 1, you can find various firearms like pistols and submachine guns. This directly implies that CEDA's policies went completely ignored by some survivors, who successfully smuggled weapons into these evacuation centers. This can be chalked up to poor security, or CEDA was simply overwhelmed with their staff and personnel already being stretched thin. Let's go over a few more CEDA papers while we're at it. Some classic CEDA posters are "Clean hands save lives" and "Wear your face mask at all times." CEDA is implanting the idea that the green flu virus is just like any other flu, and simply wearing your mask and washing your hands will prevent the spread of infection. These health tips from CEDA are not very helpful at all, because if it wasn't obvious enough already, the green flu virus is a lot more than just a flu. With that in mind, let's head over to the Sacrifice comic for more info. Bill and Zoe are seen talking to a doctor who's working on a cure for the green flu virus. He then says the following. The virus defies anything we've ever seen. Sometimes it's airborne, sometimes it's not. It mutates daily. We're trying to cure it and we can't even pin it down. The green flu virus is unlike any virus CEDA or the world has ever seen before. We can safely assume that the constant mutation of the green flu virus led to panic and distress among the agents at CEDA. Remember, Rochelle mentions that reports were fragmented, and because the virus is constantly mutating, it makes it much harder to study and research. Victims infected with the green flu virus early on could have shown flu or cold-like symptoms, but with the fundamental properties of the virus changing on a daily basis, simple medical tips like wearing a mask or washing your hands can be considered futile or pointless because of the virus's unprecedented volatility. Long story short, the green flu virus mutates so often that researching it and developing a cure is pretty much impossible. CEDA at the time, however, did not know this. In an attempt to prevent the spread of infection, CEDA started to quarantine individual locations within Pennsylvania. This would later prove to be futile. With the public and media breathing down their necks and the situation getting worse because of outside pressure, CEDA made the very poor decision to hide the severity of the green flu virus from the public, and we know this for a few reasons. Even Rochelle, who has proven herself to be reliably informed as we talked about previously, is startled by the state of things. In Chapter 1, after getting a look at the map, Rochelle states the following.
I work for a news station. We heard about the East Coast, but Jesus, I didn't know it was this bad.
Rochelle being taken aback by the severity of the virus implies that CEDA was at the very least holding back crucial information when answering questions about the virus. CEDA would eventually start taking more desperate measures to contain the virus, like shutting down airports, but the virus at this point has already spread further than CEDA could have ever predicted. Now, let's head back over to the Sacrifice comic. The Sacrifice comic delves into the backstories of each of the 4 survivors. These flashbacks take place 2 days after the first infection. We see Francis drinking at a bar, we see Lewis working at his job, and we see Bill getting surgery at a hospital. So not only are people still going into work, even the hospitals are still open. Based on this, we can safely assume that no large-scale evacuations were set in place, meaning the state of Pennsylvania was pretty much business as usual when people started to turn into zombies. We see characters in the comic who are clearly aware of the virus's existence, but most people just write it off as a flu, not taking it seriously at all. Even if there was some kind of evacuation order in Pennsylvania, it's clear that most citizens were not taking it seriously. Now, in defense of CEDA, you can find a newspaper clipping showing that airports were shut down because of the virus, and Lewis is seen arguing with a coworker because he won't come into work, meaning some people were taking CEDA's warning about the virus seriously. However, at that point, it was already too late. These series of mistakes would lead to public distrust among the remaining survivors, and the general public did not have the highest opinions on CEDA, evidenced by the CEDA sucks wall graffiti found throughout most of the Left 4 Dead campaigns. Rochelle also has this voice line in Chapter 1 of Dead Center.
I think CEDA should have been telling us to do more than wash our hands.
This suspicion isn't just shared among the main characters. Wall graffiti found in Chapter 4 directly states that the virus is not a flu, and to get out while you can. This next bit is probably my favorite. Don't believe the signs. Washing your hands won't help when they attack you. You can definitely argue that CEDA may not have known the true severity of the green flu virus, and sure, that is a possibility, considering the virus is mutating on a daily basis. Regardless, this is when things would take a turn for the worse. The green flu virus then started to turn people into zombies, and with the death toll rising and the infection only spreading further and further, nationwide panic would then ensue. Riots were taking place in major cities across the United States, and CEDA was forced to take more desperate action. Now, if you're at all familiar with Left 4 Dead's story, or read the title of this video, you'll know that even with these harrowing mistakes made by CEDA, they are not the only ones at fault here. Let's head over to the Sacrifice comic once again. Shortly after the ending of Blood Harvest, the survivors are grouped up in the back of an armored APC. Instead of being taken to Outpost Echo, they were instead taken to Fort Millhaven for testing. This is where we meet Lieutenant Mora, one of the commanding officers present at Fort Millhaven. Mora was one of the soldiers who picked up the survivors at the end of Blood Harvest, and what's most notable about this character is his very negative outlook on the carriers. In the Sacrifice comic, Lieutenant Mora flat out says that if it were up to him, he'd kill every single carrier. The doctor at Fort Millhaven also says that once the military learns that a cure is impossible, they'll be lined up against the wall and shot. Now, putting aside his burning hatred for the carriers, Lieutenant Mora is also concerned about the security of Fort Millhaven. After seeing the special infected live in person at the end of Blood Harvest, Mora then writes a report to his superior officer, Major Everly, and strongly recommends falling back to Echo Base and letting go of the carriers. His request is strictly denied. To further add to the lieutenant's growing paranoia, at the start of Part 2 of the Sacrifice comic, Lieutenant Mora is seen talking about the lack of communication from CEDA and their chain of command. Mora states that they are on their own, and after his argument with Major Everly, Mora stages a mutiny and takes over Fort Millhaven by sounding the alarm and attracting the infected. The plan was to escape with his squad and retreat to Echo Base. This, however, was a massive mistake. It's safe to say that Lieutenant Mora underestimated the infected. Or to be more accurate, he didn't take into account the zombies' lightning-quick speed. This is highlighted best at the beginning of Part 3 of the Sacrifice comic. Two of Mora's men are seen walking along the perimeter of Fort Millhaven, and after the alarm sounds, all it takes is a few seconds and the infected are already swarming the base. Sure, it's a comic and it's hard to measure time from panel to panel, but that alarm could not have been blaring for longer than 10 seconds and 2 guards are already dead. Mora is later seen fighting with his men outside of Fort Millhaven, but after getting scratched by a zombie and getting his mask knocked off, Lieutenant Mora is then left for dead by his men. Despite being infected, Mora pleads to be lifted up, thus risking the lives of his men in the process. Despite framing himself as a fearless leader who staged a mutiny to protect his platoon, in his final moments, Mora shows his true colors. He was only ever concerned about saving himself. As you can probably guess, Lieutenant Mora's plan went horribly wrong, and it resulted in the deaths of almost everyone at Fort Millhaven. Even if there were any survivors, like Annie and Jeff for example, it's safe to assume they didn't get very far. As the survivors are running to the train, we can see 2 tanks climbing the exterior of Fort Millhaven, with countless infected swarming the base from every direction. Fort Millhaven is completely overrun because of the selfish and paranoid actions of a single lieutenant. You can argue that this turned out very well for the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors because, as the doctor said, they would likely be lined up against the wall and shot once they learned of the impossibility of a cure. But putting that aside for a second, countless soldiers and a doctor lost their lives in very brutal fashion because of Mora's failed rebellion. This would plant the seed of distrust between the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors and the military throughout the remainder of Left 4 Dead's story. In the passing campaign, for example, Lewis and Francis say multiple times that they have had enough with the military. You can argue that Lieutenant Mora was just a one-off example, someone who let his paranoia get the better of him and developed an unrealistic hatred for the carriers. Sadly enough, however, Lieutenant Mora is not the only person who has a very negative outlook on the carriers. Not only that, the next campaign we're going to talk about tells us a lot about the military's treatment of the carriers during the early stages of the green flu outbreak. As I mentioned in prior videos, the Parish is my favorite campaign from a narrative perspective. I already made a video going over the story behind this campaign, so for this segment of the video, I'm going to do my best to go over stuff that I missed, and mainly focus on the evacuation efforts in New Orleans, and how it all went horribly wrong. It also gives me the chance to clarify a mistake I made in my original video. Now, let's get started. At the very start of Chapter 1, you can find signs placed by the military. One of the signs reads as follows: "Stay in your group. Do not remove your color-coded wristband and filtration mask provided to you. Use of deadly force has been authorized." So, CEDA, and by extension the military, has found a way to identify carriers. Not only that, they're using color-coded wristbands to separate the carriers from the non-infecteds. And on top of that, they even supplied the survivors with filtration masks to prevent the spread of infection. Everything looks great so far. Now, let's get to the part where it all goes horribly wrong. In Chapter 2, you can find a CEDA trailer, and before you reach the tower, you can find 2 dead CEDA agents by a table wearing hazmat suits. Also in Chapter 2, you can find a piece of wall graffiti that says the following: "Where is CEDA?" Later on in Chapter 3, you find another piece of graffiti that reads like this: "CEDA abandoned us. The army fenced us up." So, it's clear that CEDA was present in New Orleans, but at some point during the outbreak, CEDA pulled out of New Orleans, as evidenced by the "Where is CEDA" wall graffiti mentioned earlier. Maybe they understood the situation was a lost cause and willingly gave up control, or maybe they were forced out. Regardless of the reason, the military then took control of CEDA operations. This is when things start to get ugly. With thousands and thousands of people grouped up in New Orleans and the military's chain of command falling apart behind the scenes, as referenced in the Sacrifice comic, it's safe to assume that the military was losing the war of attrition and is now forced to take more desperate action to gain control of the situation. The military started to separate the carriers from the non-infecteds, but this would only lead to further panic. With a massive influx of survivors in New Orleans and the situation only getting worse by the day, the military then started to execute the carriers to prevent further loss of life. To add to the direness of the situation, large groups of rebels began to fight against the military as New Orleans fell into further chaos. In Chapter 3, you can find a barricade made out of wood and furniture. Next to this barricade, you can find a destroyed helicopter. It should also be noted that these rebel groups were not just targeting the military. In Chapter 4, you can find some wall graffiti that reads as follows: "No more CEDA bullshit, lock and load. Carriers equals zombies. Kill all carriers." To make a long story short, the buildup of confusion and panic amongst the survivors in New Orleans would eventually lead to a 3-way war between the military, the survivors, and the carriers, which resulted in the deaths of thousands. Now, with all this in mind, why did they fly out the survivors at the ending of the Parish? If you watch my video on the Parish, I theorized that the survivors could have been executed by the military, and many of you guys were quick to point out that if the intent was to just kill them, they would have just blown up the bridge and moved on. And it's a very valid point, and definitely an oversight on my part. So, let's go back to that question again. Why did the military fly out the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors instead of executing them like the other carriers found in New Orleans? We don't know the official answer to this question, but it's always fun to speculate, and the way I see it, there's only one clear answer: a change in priorities. The Doctor from the Sacrifice comic sums it up best. "They haven't killed you yet because of me. They haven't killed me yet because they want their cure. It hasn't occurred to them yet that there might not be one. That we might be the only future they've got. Carriers." The military realized that executing the carriers was a fruitless endeavor. The green flu virus has already stretched well beyond CEDA and the military's control. With the infection sweeping through the nation and the country falling into chaos, all the military can do is preserve and prepare for the future. A soldier from the Sacrifice comic recommends using them as frontline soldiers, and odds are, this is exactly what the military has in mind for a crew of survivors. More importantly, and I wish I knew this before I made my video on the Parish, you can find an interview with Valve writer Chet Falazek talking about the Parish campaign, and he can be heard saying the following: "And what we're trying to do there is get across the bridge and get to salvation by getting onto some cruise ships. Using the carriers to fight the infected certainly makes the most sense. Nick, Coach, Ellis, and Rochelle have killed an insane amount of zombies just to get to New Orleans. Now, imagine an army of carriers fighting against the infected hordes with proper military training and weaponry. It definitely lays the groundwork for a Left 4 Dead 3 that's never gonna happen. Sorry for reminding you." When doing research for this video, you can definitely make the argument that CEDA was dealt a very bad hand. The green flu virus is so dangerous and so unpredictable, a disastrous outcome would have likely happened either way. Regardless, there's no denying that mistakes were made when handling the green flu virus. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I finally get the chance to delve deeper into the lore of Left 4 Dead. If you guys have anything to add, be sure to let me know down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.